No women would touch the mountain man until a lonely Chinese girl asked to stay in his cabin during a deadly winter storm. He lived alone, scarred and shunned by every soul in town. The church bell tolled and doors slammed when he walked. By folks swore his very presence carried a curse. But one night, with snow howling against the timbers, a frail girl knocked at his cabin door. She wasn't just seeking warmth. She carried a secret that could bring down the railroad's lies, or destroy them both. As rumors spread like fire through the dusty streets, men rode hard with guns, and a cabin went up in flames. Whispers turned to judgment, and faith was tested against fear. What could drive a girl with nothing left to risk everything on the most hated man in town? And when the law, the railroad, and even God's silence close in, will this outcast mountain man lose the last chance he has to be redeemed? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more through the howling wind. Jed Carter's boots crunched in the fresh snow as he trudged up the narrow path to his cabin. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the white drifts, and his breath came out in thick clouds. His broad shoulders were weighed down by his hunting gear and the few pelts he'd managed to collect before the storm rolled in. The cabin stood alone on the ridge above the mining town of Silver Creek, Colorado. Just the way he preferred it. Folks down below called it Carter's curse, both the cabin and the man himself. Yet's fingers, rough from years of working trap lines, fumbled with his key in the iron lock. Inside, the cabin was dark and cold. Jed moved with practiced steps, setting down his gear and reaching for the tin matches on the shelf. The lantern's warm glow soon filled the single room, throwing his shadow large against the log walls. In that light, the deep scars on the left. Sight of his face stood out stark and rope-like, a permanent reminder of the night that had changed everything. Yet's stomach growled as he grabbed a tin of beans from his stores. He didn't bother heating them, just spooned the cold mixture straight from the can while standing at his rough-hewn table. Through the window, he watched the snow beginning to pile up against the glass. Least the wolves'll have trouble hunting. In this, he muttered to himself, his voice rough from disuse. Speaking to himself had become a habit over the long winters, though he tried not to think too hard about what that meant. The memory of his last visit to town crept in uninvited. He'd needed supplies, coffee, ammunition, salt pork. The way Sarah Miller had yanked her young daughter behind her skirts when he approached the general store still stung. The whispers weren't even whispers anymore. That's him, the cursed one. Don't look him in the eye, child. Devil's own luck surviving that fight. Should have died with the others. Yet spoon scraped the bottom of the tin. He tossed it aside and moved to stoke the fire in his pot-bellied stove. The wood caught quickly, but the warmth did little to chase the chill from his bones. 5 years since the brawl that had left him marked, and still the town treated him like he carried death in his wake. The wind picked up outside, rattling the window panes. In the distance, a wolf's howl pierced the growing darkness. Another answered, closer to the cabin. Jed moved to check his rifle was loaded, more from habit than real concern. His eyes caught his reflection in the window glass, the right side. Of his face normal enough, but the left, the firelight made the scars look alive, twisting across his cheek and down his neck like angry snakes. He turned away quickly. "Why'd you leave me alive?" He asked the ceiling, his voice barely a whisper. It was as close to a prayer as he got these days. What's the point of living when nobody'll come within 10 feet of me? The silence that answered was familiar as an old coat. Jed had stopped, expecting responses years ago, though the ache of abandonment never quite faded. God had better things to do than worry about a marked man in a lonely cabin. The storm was picking up proper now. Snow pelted the windows like tiny fists, and the Wind found every crack in the cabin's walls. Jed added another log to the stove and checked the door's heavy bolt. Living alone in the high country, you learn to be careful or you didn't live long. He moved around the cabin, his evening routine unchanging as the seasons. Check the windows. Clean his rifle. Sort through the day's trapline findings. 3. Rabbit pelts and 1 fox. Not his best haul, but better than nothing. The work kept his hands busy while his mind wandered. There had been a time, before the scars, when he'd had plans. A wife, maybe, children of his own. He'd been saving to buy. Land down in the valley, thinking to build something permanent. Now his future stretched out empty as the snow-covered peaks. Nothing but endless seasons of trapping and avoiding people's fearful stares. The lantern was running low on oil. Jed considered refilling it, but decided against it. He'd save the fuel for when he really needed it. Moving to the narrow bed built into the wall, he sat heavily on the thin mattress and pulled off his boots. "Another day done," he said to the darkness. Another day alone. The words hung in the air like smoke. Outside, the storm howled its agreement, and somewhere in the night, a wolf called again. Jed lay back, fully clothed except for his boots, and pulled the rough blanket over himself. The lantern sputtered once, twice, then went out completely dot in the darkness. Yet's thoughts drifted, as they often did to that night in the saloon. The argument that had turned deadly, the glint of steel. In lamplight, the pain that had seemed endless. He'd never meant to kill anyone. Had tried to walk away 3 times before the first punch was thrown. But when it was over, 3 men lay dead, and he wore their marks across his face. The sheriff had called it self-defense, but the town had its own ideas about justice. The wind moaned through the trees outside, a sound so lonely it might have been his own heart crying. Jed pulled the blanket tighter, trying to find warmth that wouldn't come. His prayers these days were short things, more habit than hope. "Lord," he whispered into the darkness, "if you're still listening, I could use a sign. Anything to know. You ain't abandoned me completely." The cabin creaked in the wind, boards shifting against each other like old bones. Jed lay awake, listening to the storm and the restless thoughts that wouldn't quiet. Sleep, when it finally came, was thin and uneasy, full of dreams of warmth and welcome that turned to ash. When he reached for them, he didn't hear the soft footsteps approaching through the deepening snow. Didn't know that answer to his prayer. Was already making its way through the darkness toward his door. The night grew deeper. The storm raged on, and Jed Carter slept his lonely sleep, unaware that everything was about to change. The stillness in the cabin was broken only by his steady breathing and the constant voice of the wind. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering tracks almost as quickly as they were made, while the wolves sang their ancient songs to the hidden moon. And somewhere in that vast darkness, someone was stumbling through the storm, drawn to the faint promise of shelter that Yet's cabin represented. The night grew colder, and the wind picked up its lonely howl, as if nature itself was lamenting the solitude of the scarred man in his mountain sanctuary. But change was coming on the winter wind, though Jed slept on, unaware that his prayer had already been heard, and that God sometimes answers in ways we least expect. Morning crept over the mountains like a cautious deer, bringing with it a world transformed by snow. The storm had passed, leaving behind drifts that reached past Yet's knees in places. He stood in his doorway, steam rising from his coffee cup, and surveyed the pristine white blanket that covered everything in sight. The air held that special kind of mountain cold that made a man's breath freeze in his beard. Jed took a long sip of the bitter coffee, letting it warm him from the inside. The sky to the west still carried heavy clouds, another storm brewing, if his aching shoulder was any judge. "Best get to it," he muttered, setting the empty cup inside. The woodpile looked smaller than he liked, especially with more snow coming. He pulled on his heavy leather gloves and grabbed his axe from beside the door. The work of splitting logs was familiar as breathing. Jed fell into the rhythm easily. Lift, position, swing, crack. The sharp sounds echoed off the surrounding trees, scaring a pair of snow buntings into flight. Sweat began to gather under his wool shirt despite the cold, and he paused occasionally to wipe his brow with his sleeve. As he worked, his mind wandered to his trapline. The fresh snow would make tracking easier, but it also meant the animals might stay in their dens. Still, he needed to check. Empty traps attracted scavengers, and he couldn't afford to lose any. More equipment this winter. The sun had climbed halfway to noon when Jed finally stacked the last split log. He doubled his woodpile, enough to see him through another week of storms if needed. His shoulders ached pleasantly from the work as he stored his axe and went inside to prepare for checking his traps. He packed light, just some jerky, his skinning knife, and an extra length of rope. The rifle he always carried up here, more for four-legged threats than two-legged ones. Most folks avoided his part of the mountain, especially in winter. The trek to his first trap took longer than usual, the deep snow making each step a challenge. But Jed knew these trails like he knew his own scarred face, moving steadily through the white landscape. The first 3 traps were empty, though he found fresh rabbit tracks nearby. The fourth held a plump snowshoe hare, its white winter coat already complete. He worked quickly, efficient motions born of years of practice. The pelt would fetch a fair price, even in town where folks preferred not to meet his eyes while trading. The meat would make a good stew, something to ward off the coming cold. The short winter day was already waning when Jed turned back toward his cabin. Shadows stretched long across the snow, and the western clouds looked darker, heavier. His prediction of another storm seemed right on the money. He quickened his pace, not wanting to be caught out after dark. He was nearly home when something made him pause. There, leading toward his cabin, tracks in the snow. Small tracks, not the broad prints of a man's boots. They meandered, dragging in places as if their maker was struggling. Something about them set his nerves on edge. Yet, hand tightened on his rifle as he approached his cabin carefully. Nothing seemed disturbed. No broken windows, door still firmly closed. The tracks disappeared around the side, then reappeared, as if their maker had circled the building before moving on. Inside, Jed busied himself with preparing his evening meal, trying to shake off his unease. The rabbit would keep until tomorrow. Tonight he had some venison left from his last hunt. He set it stewing with dried vegetables and the last of his potatoes, but his mind kept returning to those strange tracks. The cabin grew darker as evening settled in. Jed lit his lantern and pulled his Bible from its shelf, more from habit than intention to read. The book fell open to Psalms, the pages worn from years of thumbing through them. He'd stopped finding comfort in the words some time ago, but tonight, something made him pause, eyes catching on familiar verses about refuge and shelter. The wind picked up outside, carrying the first flakes of the new storm. Jed had just settled down with his bowl of stew when he heard it. A soft sound at his door, so faint he might have imagined it. He set down his spoon, listening hard. There it was again. Definitely a knock, though weak and uncertain. Jed stood slowly, years of mountain living making him cautious. He moved to the door, rifle within easy reach, and called out, "Who's there?" No answer came, just another feeble tap against the wood. Something about that sound, desperation maybe, or exhaustion, made Yet's hands move to the door's heavy bar. He lifted it carefully, keeping his body to one side as he pulled the door open. The figure that stood there was small, barely reaching his chest. A young Chinese girl, her dark hair frosted with snow, swayed slightly on her feet. Her clothes, clearly not meant for mountain weather, were crusted with ice. and her lips had taken on a bluish tinge that Jed recognized as dangerous. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the wind. "I need shelter." Her eyes, bright with fear and something like hope, met his for a moment before dropping to the ground. Jed felt his chest tighten. If anyone in town found out he'd taken in a young Chinese girl, alone, unchaperoned, what was left of his reputation would be destroyed. They already thought him cursed, dangerous. This would only confirm their worst suspicions, but the wind was rising, carrying stinging pellets of snow, and the girl looked ready to collapse where she stood. Whatever her story was, she wouldn't survive another hour in the growing storm. Jed knew what it was to be alone, desperate for kindness. "Come in," he said gruffly, stepping back from the door. "Quick, before more snow gets in." She stumbled crossing the threshold, her legs nearly giving out. Jed caught her elbow, steadying her, and felt how badly she was shaking. He kicked the door shut and dropped the bar back in place before leading her to the chair nearest the stove. "Sit," he ordered, already moving to add more wood to the fire. The girl sank into the chair like her bones had turned to water, holding her hands out to the growing warmth. Up close, Jed could see how young she was, 17 or 18 maybe, with a delicate face that showed both exhaustion and relief. He grabbed the pot of stew from where it still simmered and poured some into a clean bowl. "Here," he said, pressing it into her trembling hands. "Drink the broth first, slow-like. Too much too fast'll make you sick." She nodded, wrapping her fingers around the warm bowl. "Thank you," she whispered, the words carrying a slight accent, but clear enough. Steam rose from the bowl, and some color began returning to her cheeks as she sipped carefully at the broth. Jed busied himself, gathering extra blankets, trying not to stare at this unexpected guest. Questions burned in his mind. Who was she? Why was she alone on the mountain? What was she running from? But she looked too exhausted for interrogation, and something in her manner spoke of recent fear. He draped one of the blankets around her shoulders, noting how she tensed slightly at his approach before forcing herself to relax. "Storm's coming in hard," he said, moving back to give her space. "You can warm yourself by the fire, rest a bit." He hesitated, then added, "You're safe here." The girl's eyes filled suddenly with tears, though she blinked them back quickly. She pulled the blanket tighter around herself with one hand, the other, still clutching the warm bowl. The firelight caught the tracks of frozen tears on her cheeks, and Jed had to look away, his scarred face burning with remembered shame. The wind howled outside, rattling the window panes, but inside the cabin was warm and growing warmer. The girl continued to sip her broth, color slowly returning to her face. Jed settled into his other chair, keeping his movements slow and deliberate, like he would around a frightened deer. They sat in silence broken only by the crackling fire and the storm's voice. Jed watched from the corner of his eye as his unexpected guest gradually stopped shivering, her shoulders beginning to relax under the heavy blanket. Whatever had driven her to his door could wait until morning. For now, it was enough that she was safe from the killing cold of a mountain winter's night. The lantern light caught the relief in her eyes as she warmed her hands against the bowl, and Jed felt something shift in his chest, something that had been frozen for a very long time beginning, ever so slightly, to thaw. The fire crackled softly as silence stretched between them. Jed watched the girl warm herself, noting how her shoulders gradually relaxed under the borrowed blanket. Her small hands cupped the bowl of broth like it was precious gold, and she sipped with careful deliberation, as if savoring every drop. "What's your name?" Jed finally asked. Keeping his voice low and gentle, she glanced up, then quickly down again. "Lian Mei," she answered softly. After a moment, she added, "It means graceful plum blossom in Chinese." Jed nodded, filing away the information. I'm Jed Carter. This here's my cabin. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. Ain't many folks wandering these mountains in winter, Miss May. Especially not alone. Leon's fingers tightened around her bowl. She took another small sip before speaking, her voice barely above a whisper. My father, he was a missionary. We lived at Golden Creek Mining Camp, where he preached to the workers. Her eyes grew distant with memory. He died 3 months ago. Fever took him fast. The pain in her voice was raw, familiar. Jed knew the hollow ache of losing family. I'm sorry to hear that, he said quietly. She nodded, blinking rapidly. After he was gone, the camp boss said I owed money for our lodging. He made me work in the laundry to pay the debt. Her shoulders hunched slightly. But last week, I heard. He was planning to sell me, like property, to a man from San Francisco. Anger flared in Yet's chest, but he kept his voice steady. So you ran? Yes. Leon's chin lifted slightly, a flash of steel showing through her gentle demeanor. I took my father's Bible and what food I could carry. The storm helped hide my tracks. Jed stood and moved to the window, peering out at the swirling snow. The thought of harboring a runaway, especially a young Chinese girl, made his stomach twist. Folks in town already crossed the street to avoid him, whispered about his cursed face, his violent past. If they found out about this. But when he turned back, the sight of her huddled in his chair, clutching that bowl of broth like it was her last hope in the world, something inside him softened. He'd been alone too long, perhaps. Forgotten what? It meant to help someone in need. Storm's likely to last a couple days, he said gruffly. You can stay till it passes. After that, he let the words trail off, the meaning clear. Relief flooded her face. Thank you, Mr. Carter. I can work, cook, clean, mend clothes. I won't be a burden. Jed shook his head. Ain't necessary, but there's rules if you're staying. He held up one calloused finger. First, you don't go outside unless I say it's safe. Second, another finger joined the first. If anyone comes calling, you hide in the root cellar, quick and quiet. Understanding me? Leon nodded solemnly. Yes. Sir, I understand. Good. Jed moved to a trunk near his bed, pulling out extra blankets. You can sleep here by the fire. I'll be up in the loft. He arranged the blankets into a makeshift bed, then added another log to the stove. There's more stew if you're still hungry. But broth was enough. Thank you. Leon set her empty bowl aside carefully. Mr. Carter? She waited until he looked at her. God bless you for your kindness. Yet's scarred face tightened. Ain't much kindness left in me, Miss May. Just doing what needs doing. He climbed the ladder to his loft, leaving her to settle in by the fire. Sleep was slow to come. Jed lay in his rough bed, listening to the storm rage outside and the soft sounds of movement below. After a while, he heard something else, quiet words in Chinese, then English, flowing together like a gentle stream. Prayer, he realized. The girl was praying. He couldn't make out most of the words, but the tone was clear enough. Gratitude mixed with plea for protection. Jed turned on his side, trying to ignore the way those whispered prayers stirred something long dormant in his soul. He'd given up on God's mercy years ago, when the brawl left him marked as an outcast. But listening to Leon's faithful murmuring, he found himself wondering if perhaps he pushed the thought away. Dawn would come soon enough, and with it decisions about what to do with his unexpected guest. For now, sleep was what he needed. First gray light of morning found Jed already awake, though he hadn't slept much. He descended the ladder quietly, not wanting to disturb Leon, only to find her already up and moving about the cabin. She had folded her blankets neatly by the fire, which was burning steadily with fresh wood. The floor had been swept clean. and she sat in the chair he'd given her last night, bent over one of his old shirts. Her nimble fingers worked a needle through the fabric, mending a tear he'd been meaning to fix for weeks. "You didn't have to do that," he said, making her start slightly. "Good morning, Mr. Carter." Leon smiled shyly, holding up the shirt. "I wanted to help, to show my gratitude." The tear was not difficult to mend. Jed moved to the stove, where he found fresh coffee already made. He poured a cup, noting how she'd arranged his cooking implements more neatly than they'd been in years. "Been up long?" "A little while." She tied off her thread and snipped it with small scissors from her bundle. "I hope you don't mind about the coffee. I saw it was ready to be made, and thought, it's fine." Jed took a sip. The coffee was better than his usual brew. "You did all this while I slept?" Leon nodded, folding the mended shirt carefully. "I am used to rising early. At the laundry, we began work before dawn." A shadow crossed her face at the memory, but she quickly brightened. "I can make breakfast, if you would like. I saw eggs in your storage box." Jed studied her over his coffee cup. This young girl who had fled certain bondage, yet still rose early to sweep his floor and mend his clothes. Her father had raised her well, it seemed. The thought of sending her back out into the world alone, once the storm passed, sat heavier in his chest than he'd expected. "Breakfast would be welcome," he said finally. "But pace yourself, Miss May. You're here to rest and recover, not work yourself to the bone." "Yes, sir." She rose gracefully, setting aside his mended shirt. "And please, you may call me Leon. Miss. May sounds too formal for someone who has shown me such kindness." Jed nodded, unable to find words to respond to her gentle gratitude. He watched as she moved about his kitchen with quiet efficiency, and found himself wondering what other changes her presence might bring to his solitary life, however brief her stay might be. Outside, the storm continued to howl, but inside the cabin felt warmer somehow, more alive than it had in years. The scent of coffee mingled with the promise of breakfast, and Jed Carter, the cursed mountain man, found himself facing a morning that felt almost like hope. The blizzard showed no sign of mercy for 2 full days. Wind howled around the cabin's sturdy logs like a hungry wolf, while snow piled higher against the walls. Inside, though, warmth bloomed, not just from the well-fed fire, but from the quiet rhythm 2 souls found together. Jed woke each morning to find Leon already bustling about the cabin's single room. Her soft footsteps and gentle humming of hymns filled spaces that had known only silence. She moved through his home like a careful ghost, tidying here, straightening there, making every corner a bit more welcoming. "You don't need to fuss so much," Jed told her on the second morning, watching her scrub his few tin plates until they gleamed. Leanne smiled, not pausing in her work. "It gives my hands purpose, Mr. Carter. When hands are busy, the heart finds peace." He couldn't argue with that. His own peace came from the steady swing of his axe, splitting wood to keep them warm. The storm demanded constant feeding of the fire, and Jed found himself grateful for the excuse to stay active. It kept him from dwelling too long on the strangeness of sharing his space with another person, especially one who brought such unexpected grace to his rough existence. They fell into an easy pattern. Leon tended the inside tasks, cooking simple but satisfying meals from his stored provisions, mending clothes that had gone too long neglected, keeping the kettle full and hot. Jed handled the outdoor work, chopping wood, checking his nearby traps when the wind allowed, bringing in fresh snow to melt for water Dot at mealtimes. They sat across his small table, sharing bowls of beans seasoned with dried herbs she'd found in his cupboard, or venison stew that seemed to taste better under her care. She didn't talk much, but her presence filled the cabin with a gentle energy that made the howling storm seem less fierce Dot in quiet moments. Jed often found her sitting by the fire with her father's Bible in her lap. It was a worn thing, It's leather, cover soft with age and use. She handled it like it was made of gold, turning the pages with reverent care. Sometimes she read silently, her lips moving in prayer. Other times, she would read aloud in Chinese, the flowing words strange but peaceful to Yet's ears. My father taught me to read in both languages, she explained when she caught him listening. He said God's word speaks to all hearts, no matter. The tongue, her fingers traced the Bible spine. This is all I have left of him now. Jed noticed how she would sometimes slip her hand between the pages, as if checking that something was still there. Once, he glimpsed the corner of what looked like a letter, but she tucked it away quickly. Whatever secret that paper held, she wasn't ready to share it. The third morning dawned with blessed quiet. The wind had finally run out of fury, leaving behind a world transformed by deep snow. Jed stood at his window, watching the sun paint the white landscape with pale gold. Storms broke, he announced. Need to make a run to town for supplies. Flour's running low. Leon looked up from where she was sweeping, her face showing a flash of worry before smoothing into calm acceptance. I will keep the fire while you're gone, she said. The wood is stacked high, and I can tend things here. Jed frowned, uncertain. The thought of leaving her alone made him uneasy, but taking her to town would be even more dangerous. It'll be a few hours' ride, with the snow so deep. You sure you'll be all right? She nodded firmly. I know how to bank the fire to keep it burning steady. And if anyone comes, she gestured toward the root cellar's trap door. I remember your rules, Mr. Carter. I will stay hidden and quiet. Still, Jed hesitated. The cabin had felt almost like a sanctuary these past days, sheltering them both from the world's harsh judgment. The provisions wouldn't buy themselves, and they needed flour for bread. Very well, he said finally. But keep that door bolted, and don't answer even if someone knocks. Far as anyone knows, this cabin's empty while I'm gone. I understand. Leon gave him a small bow, a gesture that seemed as natural as breathing to her. God will watch over both of us. Yet's scarred face tightened at that, but he held his tongue. Her faith was her own business, even if he'd lost his years ago. He pulled on his heavy coat and wound a scarf around his neck. Then, checked his money pouch was secure. The ride to town was slow going. His horse had to pick its way carefully through snowdrifts taller than its knees. The morning sun sparked off the pristine white, making Jed squint beneath his hat brim. As he approached the town's outskirts, he noticed several people stopping to stare at him. Nothing unusual there. Folks always stared at his scarred face, but something felt different about their looks today. He tied his horse outside the general store and stamped snow from his boots before entering. The bell above the door announced his arrival, and conversation inside stuttered to a halt. Mrs. Peterson, the preacher's wife, hurriedly finished her purchase and scurried past him without meeting his eyes. Two other women huddled near the candy jars, whispering behind their hands. Morning, Mr. Watkins, Jed said to the storekeeper. Need flour and coffee, if you've got it. Watkins nodded stiffly, moving to gather the items. Saw smoke from your cabin these past few days, he said, trying to sound casual and failing. Storm kept you close to home, did it? That it did. Jed kept his voice neutral, though his shoulders tensed. Mighty steady smoke it was, Watkins continued, measuring flour into a sack. Almost like someone was tending it constant-like, even when folks spotted you checking your trap lines. Heat crawled up Yet's neck, but he said nothing. Let them wonder. He paid for his supplies and turned to leave, but not before catching a snippet of whispered conversation from the women by the way. Candy jars. Living up there alone with him and her so young. Chinese girl, I heard tell. What kind of man would take advantage? Yet's hands tightened on his purchases. He wanted to turn around, to shout that they didn't know anything about it. About him, about Leon. but that would only confirm their suspicious minds. Instead, he pushed through the door, the bell's cheerful jingle mocking him. Outside wasn't much better. Widow Clara Morgan was just coming up the boardwalk. She paused when she saw him, her usual friendly nod replaced by a troubled frown. "Jed." "Carter," she said, her voice low but carrying. "I hope you know what you're doing. Keeping that girl up there." "Folks are talking." "Folks always talk, Widow Morgan." Jed secured his supplies to his saddle, trying to keep his voice steady. "Don't make what they say true." "Maybe not," she allowed. "But a man with your reputation, it ain't right, her being there alone with you, whatever your intentions." Jed swung into his saddle, looking down at the widow's concerned face. "Sometimes. What's right is helping someone who needs it, no matter what folks might say." He touched his hat brim. "Good day to you, ma'am." He could feel eyes following him as he rode out of town. The whispers seemed to chase him like shadows. That mountain man and cursed and Chinese girl, tangling together into a net of scandal. By the time his cabin came into view, his jaw ached from clenching it. Smoke rose steady from his chimney, just as the townsfolk had noticed. But where they saw something suspicious, Jed saw only welcome, warmth, and safety for a soul who needed shelter. Let them talk. He knew the truth of what was in his heart, even if he couldn't quite name it yet. The bolt slid back quickly when he knocked, and Leon's relieved face appeared. "Welcome back, Mr. Carter. The fire stayed strong, and I made soup from the last of the vegetables." Jed stepped inside, letting the familiar smells of wood smoke and cooking wash away the bitter taste of town gossip. Here was truth, not in whispers and sidelong glances, but in honest work and simple kindness. "Much obliged," he said, setting down his supplies. "Reckon we can have fresh bread tomorrow, now we've got flour again." Leon's eyes brightened at that, and she hurried to help him unpack. Her father's Bible sat on the table, that hidden letter still secret between its pages. Whatever brought her to his door that stormy night, whatever she carried in that book, Jed knew one thing for certain. He couldn't regret giving her shelter, no matter what the town might say. The afternoon sun slanted through his window, turning Leon's dark hair to silk as she moved about the cabin. She hummed softly, another hymn, he thought, while measuring coffee into his pot. The scene was so peaceful, so ordinary, that for a moment Jed could almost forget the growing scandal in town. But he knew the whispers wouldn't stop. If anything, they would grow louder, spreading like wind-blown sparks until the whole territory was ablaze with speculation about the cursed mountain man and the Chinese girl who stayed in his cabin. The real question was, what would he do about it? The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Yet's cabin when the sound of approaching hoofbeats broke the peaceful quiet. Leon looked up from where she was sorting dried herbs, her eyes meeting Yet's in silent question. He moved to the window, shoulders tensing as he recognized the riders. "Sheriff's coming," he said quietly, "with someone I don't know." He turned to Leon, his scarred face grave. "Best you stay inside." She nodded, retreating to the far corner of the cabin where she could remain out of sight but still hear what transpired. Jed stepped out onto his front porch, squinting against the glare of sun on snow as Sheriff Miles, Grady and his companion drew near. The sheriff sat his horse with the easy confidence of a man used to being obeyed. Beside him, the stranger wore a fine wool coat and carried a leather document case, a businessman's outfit, not a frontiersman's. They reined up in front of the cabin, snow crunching under their horses' hooves. "Afternoon, Carter," Sheriff Grady said, his tone carrying that particular edge of false friendliness that made Yet's jaw tighten. "This here's Mr. Harrison, agent for the Western Pacific Railroad Company." Jed said nothing, just nodded once in acknowledgement. The railroad agent cleared his throat, clearly unused to such taciturn greetings. "Mr. Carter," Harrison said, reaching into his document case. I'm here on behalf of the company regarding this parcel of land. He withdrew several official-looking papers. Our surveyors have determined that your cabin sits on property recently acquired by Western Pacific for the new rail line. That so? Yet's voice was quiet, but there was steel beneath the words. Seems strange, seeing as I've got the deed to this land right here. He disappeared inside for a moment, returning with a worn document that he'd kept carefully preserved. These past 8 years. Harrison barely glanced at it before shaking his head. I'm afraid that's been superseded by new territorial agreements. He held out one of his papers, its bottom heavy with official stamps and seals. This claim was properly filed and approved by the land office last month. The railroad's purchase is entirely legal. Jed took the paper, his scarred face impossible to read as his eyes moved across the elaborate writing. Inside the cabin, Leon pressed her hands together, watching through a gap in the wallboards as the scene unfolded. This land's been mine near a decade, Jed said finally, his voice low and dangerous. Built this cabin with my own hands. Cleared the ground, planted the garden. You can't just, the law says we can. Sheriff Grady cut in. And the law is what I uphold. He shifted in his saddle, one hand resting casual-like near his gun. Now, we're being civilized here, Carter. Giving you proper notice instead of just sending in the workers. You've got 2 weeks to clear out. 2 weeks? The words came out. As a growl, in the middle of winter? The railroad schedule won't wait for spring, Harrison said primly. The company is being more than generous. I saw his survey markers myself. Leon's voice rang out suddenly as she stepped onto the porch, unable to stay silent any longer. They're still there, marking the boundaries clear as day. How can you say this isn't his land? Sheriff Grady's face hardened as he turned toward her. Well, if it ain't the Chinese girl everyone's been talking about. His lip curled slightly. Didn't know we were discussing property rights with unwanted vagrants. Jed moved so fast even the sheriff's hand couldn't reach his gun in time. In 2 long strides, he was at the edge of the porch, his big hands clenched into fists. You watch your mouth, Grady. Grady, he said, voice deadly quiet. This girl's under my protection. Anyone means her harm answers to me. A tense silence followed, broken only by the soft nickering of the horses and the whisper of wind through pine branches. Sheriff Grady's face had gone red, but something in Yet's eyes, or maybe the size of those fists, made him think better of whatever he'd been about to say. 2 weeks, Carter, he said instead, gathering his reins. That's all you get. After that, we come back with more men and proper authority. He touched his hat brim with exaggerated courtesy. Good day to you both. The 2 men wheeled their horses around and rode away, leaving twin tracks in the snow. Jed stood watching until they disappeared among the trees, his broad shoulders rigid with anger. Leon remained quiet beside him, her small hands clasped tightly together. Only when the hoofbeats had faded completely did Jed turn and stride back into the cabin. He moved like a caged bear, restless and dangerous, while Leon quietly closed the door behind them. The paper from the railroad agent lay crumpled on the table where Jed had dropped it. They can't do this, Leon said softly. It isn't right. Yet's laugh was bitter as winter wind. Right's got nothing to do with it. Railroad wants something. Railroad takes it. He ran a hand over his face, fingers catching on the old scars. Should have known this was coming. Town's been spreading west for years now. But your deed ain't worth the paper it's written on, seems like. He slumped onto a chair, suddenly looking tired. Territory's changing, Leon. Men like me, we're just in the way. She watched him for a long moment, this broad-shouldered man, who'd given her shelter when she needed it most, who defended her honor without hesitation, even against the sheriff himself. Making up her mind, she moved to the trunk where she'd stored her few belongings. What are you doing? Jed asked as she withdrew his worn leather gloves, the ones she'd noticed needed mending. "What I can," she replied simply, settling by the fire with needle and thread. "You protected me, Mr. Carter. I won't abandon you now." The quiet scratch of her needle filled the cabin as evening shadows lengthened across the floor. Jed sat in silence, watching her work, feeling the weight of conflict settle heavy across his shoulders. Tomorrow would bring its own troubles, but for now, there was a strange comfort in the simple sight of those small hands moving steady and sure, mending what was broken. Outside, the sun sank behind the mountains, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of gold and rose. Inside, Leon's whispered words hung in the air like a promise. "I won't abandon you now." Whether she knew it or not, those words had mended something in Yet's heart. Too, something he'd thought beyond repair. The gloves lay in her lap, nearly finished. Each careful stitch was a small act of defiance against those who would drive them away. Each one said, "We are here. We matter. We will not go quietly into the gathering dark. Sunday morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of winter day that made every breath visible in the air. Jed stood before his clouded mirror, attempting to tame his beard with an old wooden comb. He'd put on his least worn shirt and brushed his coat, but nothing could hide the scars that twisted down the left side of his face. "Are you certain about this?" Leon asked softly from near the fireplace, where she was wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. She'd mended it carefully the night before, hiding the worn spots with neat stitches. "Folks need to see you're here." "Proper," Jed replied, giving up on his beard. "Under my protection, not just hiding away." He didn't say what they both knew, that rumors were already flying through town about the Chinese girl living alone with the scarred mountain man. The walk to town took nearly an hour, their boots crunching through fresh snow. Leon moved carefully, in her borrowed boots, slightly too large but stuffed with rags for warmth. The morning sun caught the frost in her black hair, making it sparkle like stars dot as they approached the small clapboard church. Jed felt his steps growing heavier. How long had it been since he'd attended service? 5 years? 6? The memories of whispers and sidelong glances still stung. The bell was ringing its final call as they reached the church steps. Through the windows, Jed could see the pews were nearly full. Seemed like the whole town had turned out this morning. He placed his hand gently on Leon's shoulder, steadying them both, then pushed open the door. The buzz of conversation died immediately. Every head turned, every eye fixed on the unlikely pair in the doorway. Jed heard someone gasp, saw Mrs. Peterson clutch her hymnal to her chest as if it were a shield. But then Reverend Matthews stepped forward, his weathered face creasing into a welcoming smile. "Brother Carter," he said, extending his hand. "It's been too long. And who is this young lady?" "This here's Leon May," Jed said, his voice rough but clear. "She's staying with me while she recovers her strength. Lost her father, a missionary, some months back." The Reverend's eyes softened with genuine sympathy. "Miss May, you are most welcome here. Please, both of you, come in out of the cold." They made their way to an empty pew near the back, the floorboards creaking beneath their feet. Jed could feel the stairs following them, could hear the barely whispered comments. The family in the pew ahead shifted slightly away, as if Yet's scars might somehow be catching. But then something unexpected happened. As Reverend Matthews began the service, Leon's clear voice joined in the opening hymn. She knew all the words, her English perfect and pure as she sang Amazing Grace. A few heads turned again, this time in surprise rather than judgment. Jed didn't sing, hadn't in years, but he found himself moved by the familiar words coming from Leon's lips. "Was blind, but now I see," she sang, and he felt something stir in his chest, something he'd thought long dead. The The sermon passed in a blur of scripture and earnest exhortations about loving thy neighbor. Jed noticed how intently Leon listened, her small hands folded carefully in her lap. When the collection plate came around, she placed a carefully folded handkerchief in it, one she'd embroidered herself, having nothing else to give Dot as the congregation. Filed out after the final hymn, most people gave them a wide berth. But one woman moved against the tide. Widow Clara Morgan, her gray hair neat under her bonnet, her eyes kind in her lined face. She pressed a clean handkerchief into Leon's hands. "You're a brave girl," Clara whispered, patting Leon's arm. "Don't you mind them none. They'll come around, given time." Then she was gone, leaving behind the faint scent of lavender and the first genuine kindness they'd received. The walk home seemed longer, the winter sun already sliding toward the mountains. They walked in silence for a while, their breath making clouds in the cold air. Finally, Jed spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Used to believe, you know. Strong as anyone. After the fight that gave me these." He gestured to his scars. Seemed like God turned his face away. Or maybe it was just people who did, and I blamed him for it. Leon was quiet for several steps, considering his words. "My father always said, 'God sees past our faces to our hearts,'" she said finally. "He still sees you, Mr. Carter, even when others look away." Jed stumbled slightly, though the path was clear. Those simple words had struck him like a physical blow, shaking loose something buried deep inside. Back at the cabin, they moved through their evening routine in comfortable silence. Jed built up the fire while Leon stirred the pot of rabbit stew she'd prepared before church. The familiar sense of sage and garlic filled the small space, making it feel more like home than it had in years. As darkness gathered outside, they sat at the rough-hewn table, the lamplight casting warm shadows on the walls. Leon bowed her head and softly said grace in both Chinese and English, her words weaving together like music. After a moment's hesitation, Jed bowed his head too. "Thank you, Lord," he whispered, his voice rusty with disuse, "for sending someone brave enough to see past these scars." He heard Leon's soft amen and felt something shift inside him. Like ice breaking up in spring. They ate their stew, sharing the day's last bits of warmth and light. Outside, the wind whispered through pine boughs, and stars began to prick through the darkening sky. Inside, two souls who had been alone for so long found comfort in shared bread and quiet prayer. When the bowls were empty and the lamp burned, lo, Leon took out her father's Bible. The leather was worn smooth by years of faithful hands, the pages soft at the corners. She began to read in her clear voice, the ancient words of hope filling the cabin like music. Jed listened, his scarred face softened by lamplight, remembering other nights, other prayers. The words were different now, spoken in Leon's gentle accent, but they reached into the same empty places in his heart. Places that had been dark for so long, they'd forgotten the feel of light. As the last words faded into the quiet night, Jed realized something had changed. The cabin felt different, warmer somehow, as if the prayers and hymns had seeped into the very logs. Or maybe it was just his heart that had changed, softened by a young girl's unflinching faith and a simple act of being seen, really seen, for the first time in years. The lamp flickered low as they prepared for sleep. Leon to her pallet by the fire, Jed to his loft above. But the darkness felt less heavy now, less lonely. Something had begun to heal that day, as delicate as the first green shoots pushing through spring snow, but just as determined to grow toward the light. The morning sun brought a welcome warmth to the mountain air. Snow began to soften around the edges of Yet's cabin, dripping steadily from the eaves. Inside, Jed pulled on his boots while Leon wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, ready for their daily tasks. "Reckon we can check them snares today," Jed said, testing the give of the Snow with his foot outside the door. Ground's firm enough to walk on without sinking too deep. Leon nodded, her eyes bright with interest. I would like to learn about the snares, if you're willing to teach me. They started with the water hauling first. The creek ran swift and clear beneath a thin sheet of ice, which Jed broke with the back of his axe. Together, they filled the wooden buckets, working in companionable silence. Leon's small hands gripped her bucket determinedly, though Jed noticed she had to stop more often to rest. Here, he said, showing her how to balance the weight against her hip. Makes the load easier to bear. She mimicked his stance perfectly, and soon they had filled all the cabin's water barrels. The physical work brought color to her cheeks, and Jed found himself noticing how much stronger she looked compared to that stormy night when she'd first appeared at his door as the sun climbed higher. They ventured into the woods to check Yet's trapline. He explained each snare's placement, showing her how to read the signs of rabbit runs and deer paths. Leon absorbed every word, asking careful questions that showed she understood. See here? Jed pointed to some tracks in the softening snow. Rabbit's been through recent. Might have something in the next snare. But when they reached the spot, the snare was empty. Leon studied it thoughtfully, then walked a few paces to the side. To Yet's surprise, she began gathering thin, supple branches and unwinding a piece of string from her pocket. May I try something? She asked. At his nod, she began crafting her own snare, fingers moving surely as she explained. My father taught me this design when we lived at the mining camp. The miners' children were often hungry. Jed watched, impressed by the clever simplicity of her trap. She set it carefully in a natural gap between two bushes, weaving it so well into the surroundings that even his experienced eye had trouble spotting it. They continued along the trapline, finding 2 rabbits in Yet's snares. As they turned back toward the cabin, Leanne insisted on checking her trap one last time. There, caught cleanly, was a plump snowshoe hare. The look of pride on her face struck something in Yet's chest. Before he knew it, a chuckle escaped him, rusty and surprised, like a door opening on long unused hinges. Leon's eyes widened at the sound, then crinkled with pleasure as she joined in his laughter. Well, I'll be, Jed said, shaking his head in wonderment. Reckon you've got a gift for this, Miss Leon. They carried their catch back to the cabin, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows through the trees. Leon immediately set to cleaning the rabbits with practiced efficiency, while Jed built up the fire and put water on to heat. The comfortable routine was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats approaching. Jed tensed, reaching for his rifle, but relaxed when he recognized the familiar figure of Reverend Hobbs riding up to the cabin. The circuit preacher was a weathered man in his 60s, his silver hair visible beneath his wide-brimmed hat. He dismounted stiffly, leading his horse to the hitching post. Evening, Brother Carter, he called out. Miss May, mind if I warm myself by your fire a spell? Jed welcomed him in, noting the leather satchel the preacher carried. Leon quickly set water to boil for coffee, her movements graceful and assured in what had become her domain. Once they were settled with steaming cups, Reverend Hobbs reached into his satchel and pulled out a worn piece of paper, carefully unfolding it on the table. Jed leaned forward, recognizing the familiar lines of a survey map. Found this in the church records, Hobbs said, his finger tracing a particular section. Been keeping all the land filings since '49. This here's your original claim. Jed, clear as day, dated and witness proper. Jed studied the map, remembering the day he'd filed the claim. He'd been younger then, unscarred, full of hopes for the future. Railroad says they got a newer claim, he said gruffly. Hobbs nodded, pulling out another document. That's what got me curious. See, I remember when you filed this land. Was before the railroad even surveyed through here. Their claim date doesn't match up with their actual arrival in the territory. Leanne, who had been listening intently while preparing their supper, spoke up. Then their claim must be false, mustn't it? Wouldn't the court have to recognize Mr. Carter's rights? That's just it, Hobbs said, warming to her quick understanding. If we can prove the railroad's claim is forged, and I'm pretty certain it is, then Yet's original deed stands firm. Jed sat back, running a hand over his scarred face. The thought of fighting the railroad, of facing down not just the sheriff, but company lawyers, made his stomach knot. Ain't got the money for court battles, he said quietly. You have to fight, Leanne said, her voice soft but firm. She set down the spoon she'd been stirring with and faced him directly. This is your home. God gave you this land to tend, and those men have no right to take it with lies. Reverend Hobbs nodded approvingly. She's right, Jed. Besides, you won't be fighting alone. I'm heading to speak before the town council tomorrow. Plenty of folks getting worried about the railroad's land grabs. Time someone took a stand. The preacher stayed through supper, sharing the rabbit stew Leon had prepared. They talked more about the land claim, about similar cases in other territories where settlers had successfully defended their rights. When Hobbs finally rode out, the night was full of stars. Jed stood in the doorway, watching until the preacher's horse disappeared into the darkness. Behind him, he heard Leon begin to sing as she mended one of his shirts by the fire. Her voice was clear and sweet, carrying the familiar words of "Be thou my vision" into the night air. He closed the door and settled into his chair, watching her neat stitches and listening to her song. The familiar weight of hopelessness that had pressed on him for so many years felt lighter somehow. Maybe it was the evidence in Hobbs's satchel, or Leon's quiet certainty, or simply the way her hymn seemed to fill all the empty spaces in his cabin. Whatever it was, for the first time since he'd seen that railroad agent's paper, Jed felt something stir in his chest that felt remarkably like hope. He found himself humming along softly as Leon started another verse, her needle flashing. In the firelight like a star guiding them home. The morning dawned clear and cold, frost sparkling on the cabin windows. Jed pulled on his best shirt, the one Leon had carefully mended, and watched as she wrapped her father's Bible in a clean cloth, tucking it into her pocket. The hidden survey map lay secure in Reverend Hobbs's satchel, waiting to be revealed. At the town council meeting, "Ready?" Jed asked, adjusting his coat collar. His stomach churned at the thought of facing the townsfolk, but Leon's steady presence beside him helped calm his nerves. She nodded, wrapping a borrowed shawl around her shoulders. "We must stand for truth," she said simply, her quiet conviction strengthening his resolve. They rode double on Yet's horse, following the trail down into town. The morning bustle slowed as they passed, faces turning to watch their progress. Jed felt the familiar weight of stares on his scarred face, but today he sat straighter in the saddle, refusing to duck his head. Reverend Hobbs waited for them outside the mercantile, where the town council held its meetings. A small crowd had already gathered, drawn by news that the mountain man was challenging the railroad's claim. "Brother Carter," Hobbs greeted them warmly, helping Leon down from the horse. "Miss May, the council's ready to hear us." Inside, the mercantile's back room had been arranged with chairs facing a long table where 5 council members sat, including Sheriff Miles. The railroad agent lounged against the wall, his expression smugly confident. Yet's boots echoed on the wooden floor as he walked forward, conscious of every eye in the room. Leon followed close behind, her head high despite the whispers that rippled through the crowd. Reverend Hobbs stepped up to address the council, his weathered voice carrying clearly. "Gentlemen, we're here today to present evidence of a legitimate land claim that predates the railroad's filing." He spread the old survey map on the table. pointing out Yet's properly witnessed signature and the official territory stamp. This claim was filed and recorded in 1849, well before the railroad even reached Colorado territory. The council members leaned forward, examining the document. Sheriff Miles frowned, but the others showed genuine interest. The railroad agent pushed away from the wall. "That paper is meaningless. We have a newer claim, properly filed and stamped." "A claim," Hobbs countered, "dated before your company even surveyed this region. How do you explain that discrepancy, sir?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Jed saw several heads nodding, including old Sam Tucker, who'd been trapping these mountains since before the territory was formed. Leon stepped forward then, her voice clear, though her hands trembled slightly. "If I may speak?" At the council chairman's nod, she continued, "I've walked Mr. Carter's land. I've seen his boundary stones, carved with dates that match this map. They're set deep and weathered, not new markers that could have been placed recently." Her earnest testimony caught the crowd's attention. Several women who had previously turned away from her now listened intently, their expressions softening as she described the land's features with careful detail. The council chairman, a silver-haired man named Peterson, studied the map again. "These boundaries do align with the original territory surveys," he said slowly. "And if there are dated stones still standing, I move we send a committee to examine these boundary markers," one council member suggested. "Compare them against both claims." The railroad agent's face darkened. "The company won't stand for this interference. The company," Reverend Hobbs interrupted firmly, "must abide by territorial law like anyone else. Unless you'd care to explain to a judge how you filed claim to land use before surveying it?" More nods from the crowd now. Jed felt something shift in the room's atmosphere, a turning of the tide as people began to see through the railroad scheme. Old Sam Tucker pushed forward through the crowd, his lined face serious. "I remember when young Carter here filed that claim," he said gruffly. "Helped him mark those boundaries myself. Any man saying different is lying through his teeth." He turned to Jed, extending his calloused hand. "Ain't spoken much since your trouble, boy, but you always dealt square. Reckon it's time we remembered that." Yet's throat tightened as he gripped the old trapper's hand. For years, he'd felt invisible in this town, marked only by his scars. Now Sam's gesture seemed to break some invisible barrier. Other men stepped forward to shake his hand. Miners who remembered his fair trading, farmers who'd benefited from his hunting skills. Even a few women offered small smiles to Leon, seeing perhaps for the first time the quiet dignity in her bearing. The council voted to send a committee to examine the boundary stones the next day. As people filed out of the mercantile, Jed noticed the railroad agent slip away, his face dark with frustrated anger. Leon's eyes shone as she looked up at Jed. "They listened," she said softly. "They saw the truth." Reverend Hobbs clasped Yet's shoulder. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, brother. Sometimes it takes a storm to clear the air." They rode home as afternoon shadows lengthened across the snow. Jed felt lighter somehow, as if a burden he'd carried for years had begun to lift. Leon hummed softly as they climbed the trail, an old hymn that seemed to match the peaceful mood of the darkening day dot at the cabin. They found their first surprise. Someone had left a paper-wrapped package on the porch. Inside was a freshly butchered haunch of venison with a note in Sam Tucker's cramped handwriting. "From yesterday's hunt. Share it in good health." While Leon prepared the meat for cooking, more visitors came quietly up the trail. Martha Wilson, the miller's wife, brought a basket of early storage apples, saying she had too many to keep. Young Tommy from the General Store delivered a sack of coffee beans his father had ordered by mistake. Each visitor left quickly, not lingering for thanks, but their gifts spoke volumes. These weren't offerings of charity, But the small kindnesses of neighbors, the quiet acknowledgement of community as darkness fell. Jed and Leanne sat down to a supper of venison stew, fresh bread, and baked apples. The cabin felt warmer somehow, filled with the lingering presence of the day's visitors and the simple gifts they'd brought. "Seems folks are remembering who you really are," Leon said softly, passing him a plate. They needed reminding that scars don't change a person's heart. Jed looked around the cabin, at the fresh food on the table, at Leon's gentle smile, at the evidence of neighbors' kindness, and felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The deep, quiet joy of belonging. They ate their supper in comfortable silence, watching shadows dance on the walls as the fire crackled in the hearth. Outside, an owl called softly in the gathering night, and for the first time in years, its cry didn't sound lonely to Yet's ears. The venison was tender. The apples sweet with cinnamon Leon had carefully sprinkled from their precious store. Each bite seemed to carry the taste of something more than food, the flavor of acceptance, of community restored, of hope taking root like a strong young tree after winter's long cold. The next morning dawned crisp and clear. Frost sparkled on bare tree branches, and the snow had settled into hard-packed drifts. Jed pulled on his heavy coat and gloves, preparing to haul more firewood from the stand of pines below the cabin. "I'll have hot coffee waiting when you return," Leon promised. Already stoking the breakfast fire, she'd tied her long black hair back with a faded ribbon, her movements sure and practiced in the small cabin space they now shared. Jed nodded, touched by her quiet care. "Won't be more than an hour or so. Got the axe sharp enough to make quick work of it." The mountain air bit at his face as he trudged down the slope, dragging his empty sledge. His breath fogged in the morning light. Birds called from the trees, chickadees and nuthatches going about their winter foraging. Everything seemed peaceful, ordinary. He just finished splitting the first load of pine logs when he heard it, the soft crunch of snow behind him. Before he could turn, something hard struck his shoulder. Jed stumbled forward, dropping the axe as pain blazed through his arm. A man's voice snarled, "Railroad sends its regards, Carter." Jed spun to face his attacker, a stranger in a dark coat, holding a heavy length of wood like a club. The man's eyes were cold, professional. This was no random assault. The gunman swung again. Jed barely managed to dodge, his boots slipping in the snow. The club whistled past his head, close enough that he felt the wind of its passage. His attacker was fast, clearly experienced in this kind of work. "Ain't personal," the man said, circling. "Just business. Railroad wants you gone, one way or another." Yet's shoulder throbbed where the first blow had landed. He kept his voice steady. "Reckon they're worried about that land claim hearing tomorrow." The gunman's only answer was another rush forward, swinging the club in a vicious arc. This time, Jed was ready. He caught the man's arm, using the attacker's own momentum to throw him off balance. They crashed together into a snowbank. The fight became a brutal wrestling match. The gunman was younger, but Jed had the advantage of size and the strength built from years of mountain life. They rolled in the snow, trading blows. The club went flying. Jed tasted blood from a split lip. Finally, Jed managed to pin his attacker. Face down in the snow, the man thrashed and cursed, but couldn't break free. Jed grabbed a handful of dark coat and hauled the gunman up enough to speak directly into his ear. "Tell your railroad masters this," Jed growled. "Next man they send won't walk away. This is my land, my home." He shoved the gunman face first into the snow one more time before letting him up. The man scrambled to his feet, spitting snow and blood. His cold eyes had something new in them now. Respect, maybe, or fear. "You're a dead man, Carter," he said, but the threat sounded hollow. He backed away, then turned and ran, disappearing. Into the trees. Jed stood in the churned-up snow, breathing hard. His shoulders screamed with pain, and he could feel new bruises forming on his ribs. But he was alive. And he'd sent a message. He heard running feet crunching through snow and turned to see Leon hurrying down the slope, her face white with worry. "Jed, I heard fighting. Are you hurt?" "I'm all right." He tried to reassure her, but winced as he moved his shoulder. "Railroad sent one of their men to persuade me to leave. Didn't work out like they planned." Tears welled in Leon's dark eyes as she saw his injuries. "This is because of me," she said softly. "If I hadn't come here, hadn't encouraged you to fight the railroad's claim. No." Jed's voice was firm. He reached out with his good arm and gripped her shoulder gently. "This land was mine before you came. The railroad would have tried to take it either way. You gave me the courage to stand and fight for what's right." Leon's tears spilled over. "But you're hurt. They'll try again. Maybe we should just go. This is our home now," Jed said, surprising himself with the words, but knowing they were true. "You're my family, Leon. The only family I've had in years. I won't let them drive us out." She stared up at him, hope warring with fear in her expression. Then she straightened her shoulders and wiped her eyes. "Then we will fight together. Come, I must tend those bruises before they swell worse." Back in the cabin, Leon insisted Jed remove his shirt so she could examine his injuries. Her small hands were gentle as she applied snow wrapped in cloth to his shoulder, then made a poultice of herbs from her father's medical kit. All the while, she hummed softly, a hymn that seemed to fill the cabin with peace despite the morning's violence. "Your father taught you healing?" Jed asked, trying to distract himself from the pain as she worked. Leon nodded. He believed in healing both body and spirit. The miners would come to him with injuries, and he would treat them while sharing God's word. She tied off a bandage with practiced ease. "He taught me that every skill is a gift to be used in service to others." Outside, the wind was picking up, driving small pellets of ice against the window panes. Another storm was building in the iron-gray sky. Jed could smell it coming, the heavy scent of snow on the wind. "Storm's going to be bad," he said, carefully pulling his shirt back on. "Might keep the railroad's men away for a few days at least." Leon moved to the small kitchen area, pulling out flour and lard. "Then we will prepare. I will make biscuits. We need strength for whatever comes." Her hands moved surely, measuring ingredients by memory. "And you should sharpen your axe again." The handle was scratched in the fight. Jed retrieved his axe from where it had fallen in the snow. The blade was still keen, but she was right. The handle needed attention. He settled in his chair by the fire, pulling out his weighting stone and a piece of sandpaper. The familiar rhythm of sharpening steel was soothing. Each stroke of stone on metal seemed to strengthen his resolve. This cabin, this piece of mountain, it wasn't just shelter anymore. It was home. A home shared with this brave young woman who had brought light back into his dark world. Outside, the storm clouds gathered. Wind moaned through the pine trees, and the first heavy snowflakes began to fall. Inside, the cabin was warm with firelight and the smell of baking biscuits. Leon hummed as she worked, her presence as comforting as the hearth's glow. Jed tested the axe's edge with his thumb, sharp enough to split hair or defend what was his if it came to that. He looked at Leon, so focused on her baking, and felt a fierce protectiveness surge through him. The railroad's men might come again, but they would find no easy victory. Here the storm settled in as afternoon faded toward evening. Leon's biscuits came out of the oven golden brown and steaming. She insisted Jed eat 3, saying he needed to keep up his strength. Her own hands trembled slightly as she ate, betraying her lingering worry. "We'll be all right," Jed said quietly, reaching across the table to touch her hand. God didn't bring us together just to abandon us now. Leon's smile was like sunrise breaking through clouds. You sound like my father, she said. He always said faith was strongest when tested by trials. The wind howled outside, but within the cabin's walls, peace had settled again. Yet's axe leaned ready by the door, and Leon's quiet prayers mixed with the storm's voice. Whatever came, next they would face it together as family. Night settled heavily over the mountain, bringing fresh snow that fell in thick, silent flakes. Inside the cabin, Jed and Leon finished the last of their supper, venison stew with the golden biscuits she'd baked earlier. The fire crackled warmly in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. Leon gathered the tin plates, humming softly as she moved to wash them. Yet's bruised shoulder still ached from the morning's fight, but the herb poultice had helped. He watched her work, marveling at how natural it felt now to share his home with another soul. The first warning came as a whiff of smoke, sharp and raw, not the sweet scent of pine burning in the fireplace. Yet's head snapped up, nostrils flaring. Years of mountain living had honed his instincts. Something's burning, he said, rising from his chair. Outside. Before he could reach the door, orange light flared through the window. A bottle crashed through the glass, spraying burning kerosene across the floor. Flames leaped up the wall as more bottles shattered against the cabin. Leon! Jed shouted. Get down! She dropped to the floor as another window exploded inward. Smoke began filling the cabin, thick and choking. Through the broken windows, Jed caught glimpses of dark figures moving in the snow. The back door, he ordered, grabbing his coat from its peg. Stay low and move. Leon crawled through the thickening smoke, coughing. Jed snatched up his axe with one hand, wrapping the other around Leon's shoulders. He threw his heavy coat over her as they reached the door. The cold hit them like a slap as they burst outside. Snow swirled in the firelight, and two shadowy figures charged toward them through the darkness. Jed pushed Leon behind him, raising his axe. Run! He commanded her. Head for the trees. The first attacker came in swinging a club. Jed caught the blow on his axe handle, then drove his shoulder into the man's chest. They went down in the snow together. The second man tried to circle around toward Leon. Jed roared, surging up from the ground. He swung the axe in a flat arc, not with the blade, but with the heavy butt end. It caught the second man in the ribs with a satisfying crack. The man stumbled backward. Cursing dot flames were consuming the cabin now, turning night to hellish day. Smoke poured from the windows and roof. The first attacker scrambled up, blood streaming from his nose where Yet's elbow had caught him. He backed away, then turned and ran. His partner followed, clutching his side where the axe had struck. Burn in hell, Carter, he shouted over his shoulder. Jed didn't waste breath responding. He ran to where Leon huddled in the snow, wrapped in his coat. She was coughing violently, her face gray in the firelight. Come on, he said, pulling her to her feet. We need to get further from the smoke. They stumbled through deep snow toward the tree line. Behind them, the cabin blazed like a torch against the night sky. The heat was intense enough to melt snow. 20 feet away. Leon's coughs grew weaker, and she sagged against him. Stay with me, Jed urged, half carrying her now. Just a little further. Shouts carried through the cold air. New voices, coming up the trail from town. Lanterns bobbed through the trees. Help was coming, drawn by the fire's glow. Over here, Jed called out hoarsely. The first neighbors to arrive were the Petersons, carrying buckets. More followed. The blacksmith, several miners, even the widow, who had given Leon the handkerchief at church. They formed a bucket line from the stream, but it was already too late. The cabin was fully engulfed. Leon's legs gave out. She slumped in Yet's arms, her breathing shallow and ragged. The smoke had been too much. She needs help, Jed said desperately to the gathering crowd. Please. Some of the women drew back, whispering. He heard the word cursed pass among them. But the widow stepped forward. "Take her to Reverend Hobbs," she said firmly. "He'll know what to do. And his house is closest." Jed scooped Leon up in his arms. She felt terribly light, like a child. Her head lolled against his chest as he started down the trail toward town. Behind him, the cabin collapsed in a shower of sparks that rose like fireflies against the snowy sky. The parsonage was a small white house next to the church. Light glowed in its windows, and smoke from its chimney rose straight up through the still air. Reverend Hobbs himself opened the door at Yet's pounding. "Good Lord," the preacher breathed, taking in their smoke-blackened faces. "Bring her in." Quickly, inside, the Reverend's wife had already begun clearing space on their settee. She brought blankets while Hobbs stoked up the fire. Jed laid Leanne down gently, reluctant to let go of her hand. "She breathed too much smoke," he explained, his voice rough. "The cabin, they burned it. Railroad men." More townspeople were arriving, crowding into the parsonage's small front room. They spoke in hushed voices, some sympathetic, others fearful. Jed heard more whispers about curses and bad luck following him. Mrs. Hobbs shooed most of them back, then began brewing strong tea with honey. The Reverend examined Leanne, listening to her labored breathing. "She needs clean air and rest," he said. "And prayer wouldn't hurt." He looked up at Jed. "You can stay here tonight, both of you." "Thank you," Jed said hoarsely. He sank into a chair beside the settee, still holding Leon's small hand. His own injuries from the morning's fight screamed at him now that the immediate danger was past. The widow who had helped earlier brought him a cup of tea. "You saved her life," she said quietly. "That counts for something with the Lord, I reckon." No matter what some folks say about curses, Jed didn't answer. He was watching Leon's face, willing her to keep breathing. Her skin was pale beneath the tears that soot smudges, but some color was slowly returning to her cheeks. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the tracks of violence. The fire on the mountain had died to a sullen red glow. Everything Jed owned had burned with the cabin, except his axe, still clutched in one hand, and the coat he'd wrapped around Leon. Reverend Hobbs stationed himself by the door, turning away, the merely curious while allowing in those who truly came to help. The widow organized other women to bring food and extra blankets. Gradually, the crowd thinned to just a few who stayed to pray. Leon stirred finally, her eyes fluttering open. "Jed?" she whispered. "I'm here," he said, squeezing her hand. "You're safe." She tried to sit up, but he gently pressed her back down. "The cabin? Gone," he said simply. "But we're alive. That's what matters." Tears leaked from her eyes, cutting clean tracks through the soot on her face. "All my father's things, his Bible. Shh." Jed stroked her hair back from her forehead. "We'll rebuild. Somehow." Reverend Hobbs cleared his throat. "The church council meets tomorrow morning. I think it's time they heard the full truth about the railroad's claims and their methods." He looked meaningfully at Yet's bruises and Leon's smoke-stained face. God's light has a way of exposing darkness. Leon's coughing had eased, but her breathing was still shallow. Mrs. Hobbs brought more tea with honey, helping her sit up enough to sip it. The warmth seemed to help. Through the parsonage windows, Jed could see fresh snow beginning to cover the footprints leading to his door. Tomorrow would bring new battles. But tonight, watching Leon breathe easier with each passing hour, he felt something like peace despite their losses. The widow stationed herself in a corner with her knitting, clearly planning to stay the night. Other neighbors drifted in and out, bringing what comfort they could. Not all faces were friendly. Some still whispered about curses and bad luck, but enough showed kindness to give hope. Leon dozed fitfully on the settee, her hand still clasped in Yet's. The fire burned low in the hearth as midnight approached. Outside, snow continued to fall, burying the tracks of those who had tried to destroy them. Dawn crept through the parsonage windows, painting pale squares on the wooden floor. Jed hadn't slept. He sat in the same chair where he'd kept vigil through the night, watching Leon's chest rise and fall beneath the borrowed quilts. Her breathing had steadied, but her face remained ashen. Mrs. Hobbs moved quietly around the front room, stoking the banked fire and setting water to heat for coffee. The widow who'd stayed through the night gathered her knitting, patting Yet's shoulder as she left. He flinched at the touch, then immediately regretted it when he saw hurt flash across her weathered face. "I'll bring by some fresh bread later," she whispered, then slipped out into the snowy morning. Yet's muscles ached from the fight and from sitting motionless all night. His clothes stank of smoke. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw flames consuming his cabin, heard the railroad. Men's threats. The peace he'd felt last night had burned away with the darkness, leaving only bitter ashes of doubt. Reverend Hobbs entered from his study, a well-worn Bible tucked under his arm. "How is she?" he asked softly. "Breathing easier," Jed replied. "But weak." The preacher nodded, settling into a chair across from him. "And you?" "Those bruises look painful." Jed touched his jaw where one of the attackers had landed a solid punch. "I'll heal." He paused, staring at his soot-blackened hands. "But anyone near me seems to suffer. Maybe they're right about me being cursed." "Now that's just foolishness," Mrs. Hobbs said sharply from the kitchen doorway. "The only curse I see is people's fear making them cruel." But Jed barely heard her. His mind was already racing ahead, plotting a path into the high country where he knew caves that could shelter him through winter. He had his axe, his coat, now draped over Leon, and the skills to survive alone. It would be better for everyone, especially Leon. "I need some air," he muttered, standing abruptly. Outside, fresh snow had transformed the world. The church steeple rose clean and white against the morning sky. No smoke rose from where his cabin had stood, just pristine drifts covering the ashes of his life. Yet's boots crunched in the new snow as he paced the churchyard. The town was starting to wake. Shutters opened, revealing faces that quickly drew back when they saw him. A mother hurried her children across the street to avoid passing near him. "Going somewhere?" Reverend Hobbs' quiet voice made him jump. The preacher had followed him out, his breath making clouds in the cold air. "You know I can't stay," Jed said roughly. "Look what happened to my cabin. To Leon, everything I touch turns to ash. So you're running?" There was steel in the old man's voice now, proving all the gossips right about the cursed mountain man who can't face his troubles. "Better than bringing destruction on everyone who tries to help me." Yet's voice rose sharply. Several townspeople turned to stare. "The only destruction I see," Hobbs said firmly, "is what you're doing to yourself. And that girl in there who needs you. She needs someone better than me. Someone whose past won't hurt her. She needs family, the family God provided." The preacher stepped closer. "You think it was accident that brought her to your door that night. That gave you someone to protect, to care for." Jed turned away, unable to meet his eyes. "I'm no good at caring for anyone. Look what happened. I am looking. I see a man who fought off attackers to save her, who carried her through smoke and snow to safety, who hasn't left her side all night." Hobbs laid a hand on his shoulder. "That's not curse, Jed. That's blessing." Before Jed could respond, Mrs. Hobbs appeared in the doorway. "She's awake," she called softly, "asking for you." Inside, Leon had managed to sit up against the pillows. Her face was pale, but her eyes were clear and focused. When she saw Yet's pack by the door, understanding dawned in her expression. "You're leaving," she said. It wasn't a question. Jed couldn't meet her gaze. It's better this way. Safer for you. Safer? Her voice cracked slightly. Without the only family I have left? I'm not your family. I'm just a scarred old mountain man who brings trouble. God put me here to be your family. Oh. Weak. Her voice held conviction. If you send me away, I lose my purpose. She started coughing, the force of it shaking her small frame. Mrs. Hobbs hurried to help her drink some water. When the coughing subsided, Leon continued, my father taught me that God doesn't make mistakes. He led me to your cabin that night for a reason. To nearly get killed by fire, Yet's voice was bitter. To find home. She reached for his hand. This time, he didn't pull away. To help a lonely man, remember he's not cursed, but blessed. Listen. To her, Jed, Reverend Hobbs said quietly. She speaks truth. Jed sank into the chair beside her, still holding her hand. The weight of years of isolation, of bearing scorn and whispers alone, suddenly seemed to crush him. His shoulders shook. I don't know how to be family anymore, he whispered. I've been alone so long. Then we'll learn together. Leon's fingers tightened on his. But first, you must ask for strength. Jed knew what she meant. Prayer had been foreign to his lips for so long. But here, in this moment, the words came. Lord, he began hoarsely, I don't understand your ways. Why you let me live when others died. Why you sent this girl to my door. His voice broke. But if she's right, if this is your purpose, then help me. Help me be worthy of this gift. This family. Tears ran freely down his cheeks now, dropping onto their clasped hands. Leon's other hand came up to rest on his bowed head. Amen, she whispered. The morning light streamed stronger through the windows now, warming the room. Outside, church bells began to ring, calling people to Sunday service. Jed could hear footsteps and voices as townspeople gathered. The council meets after service, Reverend Hobbs reminded them. Will you stay? Jed looked at Leon, saw the trust in her eyes. Slowly, he nodded. We'll stay, both of us. Mrs. Hobbs smiled approvingly. Good. Now let me fetch you both some breakfast. Can't face railroad men on empty stomachs. As she bustled away, Leon's hand remained steady in Yet's. The pack by the door stood forgotten. Outside, snow continued to fall, but inside, warmth spread through the room, not just from the fire, but from something deeper. Something like hope. Reverend Hobbs opened his Bible, the leather worn smooth by years of use. Shall we begin the day with scripture? He asked. I believe Psalm 27 would be fitting. Leon nodded eagerly. Even Jed found himself leaning forward as the preacher began to read. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The words washed over them like healing water, and Jed felt something hard inside him begin to soften. The urge to flee into the mountains ebbed away. Here, in this moment, he was exactly where he needed to be, beside the family God had given him, preparing to face whatever came next together. The town hall's wooden floors creaked under the weight of gathered bodies. Late morning sun filtered through dusty windows, casting long shadows across weather-worn faces. Jed stood near the back, his broad shoulders tense as he watched Leon settle into a chair beside Reverend Hobbs. She still looked pale from the smoke, but determination brightened her eyes. Mayor Thompson called the meeting to order with 3 sharp raps of his gavel. The sound echoed through the cramped space like gunshots. This special session of the town council will address the land dispute between the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad Company and Jedediah Carter, the railroad agent. Mr. Whitaker rose smoothly from his seat. His suit was pressed despite the mountain dust, his watch chain gleaming gold. Gentlemen of the council, he began, voice oiled with practice. This matter is quite simple. The railroad holds clear title to the disputed parcel. He withdrew several official-looking documents from his leather portfolio. These deeds, properly filed and stamped by the Territorial Land Office, establish our right-of-way. Yet's fists clenched at his sides. The documents looked genuine enough, but he knew they were forged. His own filing predated them by years. "If I may," Reverend Hobbs spoke up, rising slowly. Age had bent his back, but not his spirit. "I have evidence that contradicts these newer claims." He unrolled the worn survey map across the council table. Several members leaned forward to study it. "This original survey, conducted 15 years ago, clearly shows Mr. Carter's claim markers. I personally witnessed his filing at that time." The preacher's finger traced the boundaries. "These stones still stand today, as Miss May can attest." Whitaker's smile tightened. "A convenient testimony from a girl of questionable status who's been living in sin with the accused squatter." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Jed started forward, face darkening, but Reverend Hobbs raised a staying hand. "That's a malicious falsehood," the preacher said firmly. "Miss May has been under my wife's care since the fire. Before that, she was an honest guest in Mr. Carter's cabin during the blizzard, an act of Christian charity that likely saved her life." Mayor Thompson shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "While the moral question is concerning, we must focus on the legal matter at hand." He studied the competing documents. "Both claims appear valid on their face. And perhaps the council should consider which party has shown good faith," Reverend Hobbs suggested. "Mr. Carter has worked that land for 15 years, improving it with his own hands. The railroad, meanwhile, sent armed men to burn him out." "Those are serious accusations," Whitaker cut in smoothly. "Unless you have proof?" "We all saw the smoke," someone called from the crowd. "And Carter's bruises tell their own tale." The mayor rapped his gavel again. "Order, please. Mr. Whitaker, these are indeed troubling allegations." The railroad agent spread his hands. "Mere speculation. What matters are the legal documents, properly filed and stamped. The railroad has plans for this territory, plans that will bring prosperity to your town." His gaze swept the council meaningfully. "Plans that could be delayed by unnecessary obstacles." The threat hung in the air like gunsmoke. Council members exchanged uneasy glances, well aware of how other towns had withered when denied railroad access. "The council must consider what's best for the entire community," Mayor Thompson said carefully. "While Mr. Carter's claim deserves respect, please." Leon's soft voice cut through the political maneuvering. All eyes turned to her as she stood, her father's Bible clutched to her chest. "I asked permission to speak." Jed stepped forward. "Leon, no. You don't have to." "Yes, I do." She met his concerned gaze steadily. "Trust me." The mayor hesitated, then nodded. "The council will hear Miss May." Whitaker's lips curved in a dismissive smile. "Really, Mr. Mayor? You'd waste the council's time with—" "The girl will speak," Reverend Hobbs said firmly. "Unless the railroad fears what she might say." A muscle twitched in Whitaker's jaw, but he sat back with calculated indifference. Leon moved toward the front of the hall, her steps slow but steady. The crowd parted before her like water. Though her hands trembled slightly on the worn Bible, her voice remained clear. "I have testimony that bears directly on this matter," she began, "and evidence that will show the truth of these competing claims." Jed watched her with growing concern, sensing she was about to reveal whatever secret she'd been carrying. The whole hall seemed to hold its breath as she opened her father's Bible, fingers finding a hidden place between its pages. The mayor leaned forward. "Proceed, Miss May." She took a deep breath, trembling but resolved. Her small figure seemed to gather strength as she stood before the assembled crowd, ready to share what she had kept hidden through all the long days of struggle and fear. "Before I speak," she said carefully, "I ask that Sheriff Miles be summoned. What I have to say should be witnessed by the law. Mayor Thompson nodded to a deputy who hurried out. The wait seemed endless as tension built in the stuffy hall. Whitaker's face had lost its smooth confidence, replaced by something harder and more calculating. When the sheriff finally arrived, boots echoing on the wooden floor, Leon squared her shoulders. Her fingers tightened on the Bible as she prepared to reveal its secret contents. With trembling fingers, Leon withdrew a folded letter from between the Bible's well-worn pages. The paper was yellowed but carefully preserved, its official seal still intact. She smoothed it carefully on the council table. This document was entrusted to my father, Reverend James May, 7 years ago. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke. It bears the signature and seal of Governor Edward McCook himself. Mayor Thompson adjusted his spectacles, leaning forward to examine the letter. His eyes widened as he read. This is an official decree granting protection and rights to Reverend May and his family as missionaries in Colorado Territory. He looked up, studying the seal. The governor's signature appears genuine. Whitaker surged to his feet. That paper proves nothing about Carter's claim. On the contrary, Reverend Hobbs interrupted. It establishes that Miss May's testimony is backed by territorial authority. Her witness to Carter's boundary stones carries the weight of law. Sheriff Miles stepped closer, examining the document. His weathered face showed grudging respect. That's McCook's seal, sure enough. Seen it before on territorial writs. He turned to Whitaker, eyes narrowing. Makes me wonder why the railroad was so quick to send gunmen instead of lawyers. The council members huddled together, speaking in low voices. When they separated, Mayor Thompson's expression was resolute. This council finds the railroad's claim fraudulent. Mr. Carter's original deed stands. He fixed Whitaker with a stern gaze. Furthermore, we'll be notifying the territorial marshal about attempted claim jumping and assault. Whitaker's face darkened, but he gathered his papers without another word and stalked from the hall. Jed stood frozen, barely breathing, until Leon's small hand slipped into his calloused one. He gripped it tightly, overcome with emotion. Justice had come from the most unexpected source. A young girl's courage and a father's final gift. "Thank you," he whispered hoarsely, meeting her bright eyes. The hall erupted in relieved chatter around them, but in that moment, their shared victory felt sacred as a prayer. The spring thaw brought warmth to the mountainside. Wagons creaked up the muddy path to Yet's property, loaded with fresh-cut timber and supplies. Men who had once crossed the street to avoid him now hefted boards onto their shoulders, calling out greetings. Jed stood quietly, his throat tight, as he watched Clara Morgan direct 3 other widows and laying out a meal on makeshift tables. Their baskets overflowed with steaming biscuits and apple pies. Mrs. Thompson, who had pulled her children away from him last summer, now spread one of her prized quilts across a stump for safekeeping until the cabin was ready. "Mr. Carter, young..." Tommy Jenkins waved from atop a pile of cedar shingles. "Where do you want these?" Leon hurried over, her face bright with laughter. "I'll help carry them." She gathered an armful of shingles, falling in step with the boys who had begun forming a line to pass materials. The sound of hammers filled the clearing as the cabin's frame took shape. Jed worked alongside men who months ago would have called him cursed. Now they shared tools and stories, pausing only to wipe sweat or grab coffee from the pot. Clara kept hot over the fire. As dusk approached, Jed and Leon stood before their rising home. The fresh-cut timber glowed golden in the setting sun. Windows were already set in place, glass panes catching the light like diamonds. "Look how many came," Leon whispered, gesturing to the scattered tools and empty pie tins that spoke of a day's shared labor. Jed nodded, watching the last wagons wind down the trail. Where there had been isolation, now there was community. Where there had been whispers, Now there were welcomes. The cabin wasn't just shelter anymore. It was proof that hearts could change, that belonging was possible. Evening settled softly around the newly built cabin. Fresh-cut pine boards glowed amber in the fading light, and smoke curled from the stone chimney into the purple dusk. Inside, Jed Carter struck a match and touched it to the lamp wick, watching the flame catch and grow. The glass gleamed like. His heart felt bright and full. Leah moved gracefully around their new table, laying out her father's china plates, saved from the fire. She had polished them until they shone, arranging them just so on the checkered cloth given by Mrs. Thompson. The cabin smelled of fresh wood and warm bread. "It's time," Jed said quietly, opening the door as neighbors began arriving. They came, bearing covered dishes and warm greetings, stews and pies, biscuits and preserves. Clara Morgan carried in a steaming pot of chicken and dumplings. The Jenkinses brought a basket of early spring vegetables from their cold frame. Reverend Hobbs arrived last, his Bible tucked under his arm. His weathered face crinkled with joy as he surveyed the gathered folks filling the cabin with chatter and warmth. "Shall we bless this home?" he asked, and the room hushed respectfully. They formed a circle, holding hands, callous palms meeting soft ones, work-worn fingers linking with young ones. Jed felt Leon's small hand in his right, Mrs. Thompson's wrinkled one in his left. The scars on his face seemed to fade in importance as love filled the room. "Lord," Reverend Hobbs began, his voice deep and sure, "we gather to bless this house and the family within it. We thank you for bringing Leon, this daughter of the Lord, to Yet's door that stormy night. We praise you for turning winter's trial to spring's blessing." "Amen," the gathering murmured. After the prayer, they shared the feast. Laughter and conversation flowed as freely as the coffee. Someone started a hymn, and soon the cabin rang with amazing grace, voices lifting in harmony. Leon's clear soprano soared above the others, her eyes shining. Jed stood by the door, accepting handshakes and kind words from each neighbor. His scarred face glowed with gratitude as he thanked them, his usual gruff manner softened by joy. Some, who had once feared him, now clapped him warmly on the shoulder, calling him friend. "This is my true home now," Leon declared proudly, standing beside him. She beamed at their guests, at the laden table, at the sturdy walls that sheltered them. "God brought me exactly where I belong." The lamplight danced on the fresh-hewn walls, casting a golden glow over the gathered community. Where once there had been solitude and whispered rumors, now there was fellowship and acceptance. The cabin had become more than shelter. It was a sanctuary of hope, a testament to changed hearts and renewed faith. Weeks passed like gentle water flowing over stones. Winter's icy grip loosened day by day, giving way to hints of spring in the Colorado highlands. The evening air still carried a chill, but inside the rebuilt cabin, warmth and contentment reigned. Lamplight cast dancing shadows on the fresh-planed walls as Jed Carter sat in his sturdy chair by the fire. The warm Bible rested open on his knee, its pages soft and familiar now from daily reading. Across from him, Leon occupied her favorite spot in the cushioned rocker, a gift from Mrs. Thompson, her needle flashing silver as she mended a shirt. "The Lord is my shepherd," Jed read, his deep voice steady and sure. "I shall not want." The words filled the cozy space, mingling with the crackle of the fire and the soft whisper of Leon's thread pulling through fabric. Through the window, they could see townspeople passing on the path below. Samuel Jenkins waved as he drove his wagon past, loaded with early spring supplies. Martha Wilson and her daughters smiled and called out a greeting. Each friendly gesture struck Jed with quiet wonder. These same folks who once crossed the street to avoid his scarred face now treated him like any other neighbor. Jed paused in his reading, watching Leon's careful stitches. Her presence had transformed the cabin from mere shelter into a true home. Fresh curtains brightened the windows, herbs dried from the ceiling beams, and the subtle scent of ginger and pine mingled in the air. More than the physical changes, though, was the peace that had settled into his spirit. "Reckon I never thought to see the day," he said softly, running his finger along the Bible's well-worn page. "Time was all folks saw when they looked at me with scandal and curse. Now," he touched his scars thoughtfully. Leon looked up from her sewing, her dark eyes warm with understanding. "Now they see what God always saw, a good man with a giving heart. The Lord works in ways we can't figure," Jed agreed. He closed the Bible carefully, laying it on the table beside him. The firelight caught the gold cross embossed on its cover, making it shine. "I spent years asking why he left me alive, all scarred up and lonely. Never thought he'd answer by sending me a daughter." His voice caught on the word, still marveling at the gift of family he'd been given. The bitter mountain man, who had hidden from the world, now sat in a home filled with love and purpose. Leon set aside her sewing and smiled, her face glowing in the lamplight. "And gave me a father," she said softly. Then, with deeper meaning, she added, "and a family." The word family encompassed more than just the two of them now. It included the townsfolk who had helped rebuild their home, the widows who brought pies and quilts, the children who stopped by to hear Leon's stories. Where once there had been whisperers and turnbacks, now there was community. Jed bowed his head, overwhelmed by gratitude. "Thank you, Lord," he prayed aloud, his voice rough with emotion, "for this home, for this daughter, for showing me your grace was here all along." The lamp burned steady and bright as peace settled over the cabin like a blessing. Outside, the last light of day painted the mountains in purple and gold, and a cool breeze carried the promise of spring. Inside, father and daughter sat contentedly, surrounded by the warmth of faith renewed and the quiet joy of belonging. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.